All right. Okay. Now we have everyone. I think I'll just start then. So hello and welcome for being here, both panel and participants. I think it's incredibly cool that we have been able to sell almost 60 tickets, and obviously not everyone is able to, make it actually in the morning, but in Corona time, as a new organization, I find that incredibly cool. Also considering that this is sort of a nerdy subject. At the same time, I think this is a subject people actually care quite a bit about, but it actually doesn't necessarily get really concrete that often. It's often up in the clouds, and that's something we want to do something about. So we have 1 hour, we have 6 speakers, not including myself. And I know I promised everyone talking time in the beginning, but seeing as we've become so many people, I'm really sorry that's not going to be possible today. So everyone enters the room muted, and please use the Slido that I've provided in the comment section to ask and vote up questions. So time is short, and I have selected everyone in the panel, not only based on their competency and their charisma, but also because I know they're very good at giving very short answers. So I think that we need to limit the discussion to the absolute core. And if you feel while we're talking that there are certain topics I'm just not doing justice to today, please suggest them to us in the comment section, and we will actually try to hold a new meeting around them and potentially involve you. So a little bit about Digital Identity Nordics. We are a fairly new non-profit volunteer organization. We're trying to bring this vision to life that we should control our own data. And to clarify what that means, there's a lot of talk about what does control of data mean. And it's often framed in a very, negative sense. There's many people fighting for preventing misuse of data. That's absolutely right. We are especially concerned about our lack of personal freedom to move our data around, to enact data portability. So that is actually what we want to discuss here today. What are we doing to achieve this, and what are the consequences of inaction? So my name is Nina Mathisen, and I founded DIN with my co-host Snorre Edvin about 7 months ago. Currently, I work in Synicat, leading their community initiative. I also happen to have a colleague here, Jon Erik, but that is because he is an expert on EID. So without further ado, I'd like to just very briefly introduce the panel of speakers. So as I mentioned, Jon Erik, EID, Finn Myrstad from Forbrukerrådet, Norwegian Consumer Council, Markus Hautala, who is from Tieto Evry, but also represents a very interesting initiative called the Findi Initiative, which is from Finland and which we will hear more about. Eirik Gulbrandsen, and with the pine panels behind him from Datatilsynet, and Johannes Brodvold from Soprasteria, who is often to be read in di.no, sharing his knowledge about and opinions about technology, and Hilde Nagel, who has written the recent debate book, Digital Revolution, from Agenda. So thank you, everyone. Then I think we can just jump right into the discussion. And as I mentioned, we all agree, I think, in this panel that control over data is a right. And I'd like to just frame what the problem is, because both Forbrukerrådet, the Norwegian Consumer Council, and Datatilsynet, the Norwegian Data Protection Authority, have issued complaints or fines, depending about data misuse. So that is clearly a priority. But, addressing you two, Finn and Eirik, would you also agree that our lack of freedom of personal data portability is also a problem that needs addressing? One of you.
Yeah, sorry, I just go ahead. Thank you for inviting us, and I think this is a really important topic, and I think it's one of the key issues. In addition to, I think there are structural problems that we have to deal with at the structural level. That could be competition. It could be how companies manipulate users to give up their rights through dark patterns, for example. It is how hidden data practices makes it impossible to make informed choices. Also about control. If you don't know what's going on, how can you actually have a meaningful, informed control or consent? So those are issues that we have to deal with at a structural level. Having said that, I think the issue of control at an individual level is really important as well, because as we have seen from our studies, is that real portability does not really happen. We did some, just to give you an example, to make it concrete, we looked at how fitness apps work a few years ago, and we actually looked at how easy it would be to move your data from one service to another. And what we discovered was, even with fitness trackers, that are pretty simple, that has like some GPS coordinates, some running times, etc., it was not possible to move your data from one service to another. And that makes actually this market that we have as consumers really, really hard. And you can't move it to feet. In the old days, you could go from one bad restaurant and never come back and take your service or custom somewhere else. And that's really hard in a digital economy today. So I really think that as long as we don't take our eye off the ball on the big structural issues, I do think that this is really an important point to stress, portability and interoperability between services, because that's also how we can potentially move away from the giants to new companies with more innovative ideas. But today we're seeing with network effects, it's really, really hard for consumers to move. So we need real portability. So I welcome this discussion. Thank you.
Eirik, I'm just throwing the ball to you. Do you agree with Finn's comments, and would you like to add anything in terms of what Datatilsynet thinks about this or is doing about it?
What I would like to add is, in fact, it's important to forget that the GDPR, in fact, is meant to make business easier, not more difficult. Because this is about doing things properly, not about not allowing things to happen. And we have, for about a year ago, we had a survey. And that survey very clearly showed that this is about trust. Because you cannot build anything without trust from the users. And we see that some parts of at least in Norway, we see that health, banks, the police have high trust. But institutions like Facebook, Google, and so on does not have almost trust at all, which means they cannot launch services. Banking services, financial services, and so on, people, at least they're saying that they don't want to use it. So GDPR, and this is about actually building trust, and that's the key and core thing we have to remember. You can do a lot of interesting stuff. You can build a lot of services. You can do AI and things like that. But without trust, a lot of that will not be very useful or very, you cannot earn money on it. So that's the key issue I want to do, just project that GDPR and personal rights are about building trust with the consumers.
But let me understand this, because I'm a bit confused. Finn's comment is that we are having a real tough time competing with the digital giants. But your point is that trust is what needs to happen to actually enact interoperability. Would you argue that the digital giants are actually beating us because they have so much more trust?
No, the other way around. I think that they have some kind of short-lived success, because in the longer run, they will experience that they will get blowback from both the people themselves, but also governments. We see that in the US now. Talking about breaking up the big companies, the Facebook and Google and so on. So I think that's the other way around.
What do you think, Hilde? Should we just wait and see then? Should we wait for this day to come when the blowback arrives?
Well, thank you, Nina, for the opportunity to discuss these very interesting and important issues. My background, as you said, is writing this book, and in writing that book, it really struck me how the big companies have managed to extract value from data sharing and using big data in a way that we as a society have not yet explored. So I think that is to follow up the point from the Datatilsynet and from Finn, that we have some opportunities here if we can trust that this is done in a way that also protect our privacy and is done in a proper way. So really an opportunity.
All right. Let me just frame the problem in a new way, in a different way. So we are spending millions of dollars, so even more millions of kroners, on GDPR compliance each year. European businesses do not seem to have closed the gap to American counterparts, and especially tech startups, or startups in general, are suffering under lack of new venture capital since 2017. So what do we do to actually achieve this goal of a stronger digital European industry, given that that was the original goal? Does anyone want to venture an answer? How do we actually achieve this dream then of interoperability?
Okay, I can give it a try. I mean, obviously from my perspective, so you can characterize me as an interest representative for consumers or users. So I come from this from one point of view. But what we see so far is a lack of enforcement in this field. I think there are. For give you an example, we did a report 2 years ago. Again, we looked at how companies are using dark patterns to undermine our privacy and consumer rights. We identified how Facebook and Google are basically using manipulative techniques to undermine our privacy. And we filed one of the first GDPR complaints in Norway, and one of the first complaints against Google following the GDPR implementation. And still, we are now actually 2 years on next week since our complaint, and the case is still pending in the Irish Data Protection Authority. And that doesn't really bode well when we know technology moves so quickly and habits change as well. If we are to expect that enforcement of the rules will take close to 5 to 7 years, because you have to counter in the court cases that will come if the decision isn't going in one or the other direction. So we see a lack of enforcement. I think that's a real problem, because that makes it not a level playing field for all the other competitors to Google and Facebook and Amazon and the other ones. So this is really, like, I think, a key first step. I think a second step from my experience working with companies or being in dialogue with companies is that they also need guidance. I think it's really hard to know what the rules are in practice. So I think the Data Protection Authority is actually doing quite a good job in creating guidance documents that I think companies should use. And then I think there is an opportunity in creating standards between companies or sort of within a business to okay, what is the standard, and try to make standards within GDPR, how we interpret it in practice. And I think that will definitely raise the level of protection, which again will create a better level of trust. And I really do think that it is also good for companies to understand how their data is being processed, how they're collecting data, how they're using their data. And I think that can actually create also more value of the data that they have if they actually respect those fundamental principles in the GDPR. So there's a few things, and then you could also ask maybe a public the role of public policy. Maybe big public entities like the government or local municipalities should have in their procurement documents have clear demands for privacy and security when they ask for a service, bids on their services, not only compete on price, for example. And we're already doing that a bit on sustainability now, doing sustainability demands. And why don't we do that on privacy and security? That will also create I think, economies of scale when it comes to delivering these kinds of services from the service industry. So these are just some thoughts on how we can make this happen.
I think that's super interesting, Finn, and I'd like to follow up on that. But first, I saw Marcus raise his digital hand, so I'd like to give him the word.
Yeah, maybe I should comment on this, because if we talk about Findi, it's actually one of the very practical initiatives where we try to solve this issue. And the way that I would frame this question is that how do we bring sort of a digital trust to the internet? And so when we think about these sort of centralized services today, what they essentially are is that they're trust infrastructures. And the way that we see that we can sort of battle against those is to take the trust into sort of a protocol layer. And when we talk about protocol in this context, we don't only refer to sort of the technical protocol, but also to contractual protocol. Because you can only go so far with the purely digital trust, but then you need also sort of human trust and contract between individuals and people. And the sort of stack that we're using is called the Trust over IP stack. So that's hosted by the Trust over IP Foundation, which is again sort of hosted by Linux Foundation. And they are aiming to establish sort of a internet scale trust protocol. So that's one of the very interesting initiatives. And also then on let's say on quite high political level in the EU, there's a sort of similar type of initiative around data sovereignty, which is called Gaia X. So that's something which is also ongoing.
Marcus, can I just interrupt you for a moment? Could you please explain, so I can understand, what this trust protocol actually means, given I don't have a degree in computer science? And also, what are you actually trying to achieve with creating this? What are you trying to do?
Yeah, so when we talk about protocol, like I said, we don't only refer to technology, but on a technical level, it means that if and when individuals and organizations exchange data over the internet, they would be able to trust that the data is immutable and original, so that you can actually sort of digitally trust that the data is unchanged. But then on top of that, you need a sort of a human layer of trust where, let's say, I as an individual receive data from or a proof from someone. Let's say that would be, for example, my driver's permit. And then I go to, let's say, a car rental place. Then the car rental place needs to really trust that the organization who provided this proof of driver's license to me is actually has solid business practices to verify that I have that particular license. So that is something that can only be agreed on the sort of a human layer of trust, and there we rely on contracts. So it's a combination of those two when we talk about the trust protocol.
Who else is in this consortium? And again, what are you actually trying to achieve?
Yeah, so a couple of the things when we talk about the actual trust over IP stack, which is basically like a framework. There are 90 different organizations related to that. So you can go and visit the Trust over IP org website for that. But then the FINDI network that you introduced earlier, that's a sort of a national implementation of that. So what we are aiming to establish is a national trust infrastructure, which would be governed by a public-private, not-for-profit cooperative. So that's essentially what we're aiming to establish during this year.
That's super interesting. Johannes, you had a question, I think?
Yes. So I think when we talk about trust, there's different dimensions of trust, of course. For me, I think the most interesting thing is, can I, as a consumer, trust that my data is treated in accordance to my freedoms? And I think that when it comes to what we're discussing here with FINDI, it's more about trusting that the data is correct and from a reputable or a trustworthy source. Is that correct? Marcus?
Yeah, let me unmute. That's exactly the case, and the way that we are viewing is that when we talk about data, we can talk about multiple things like privacy and data portability and such. But the primary focus for us is to basically simplify and ease people's lives. So when they want to conduct transactions over the internet, there would be the service providers who provision these services then could rely on digital data and proofs provided by these individuals and organizations. So what we essentially want to do is to establish a new type of channel between the issuers of data or data registries, as well as the services that are acquired by individuals and organizations, where as according to the my data model, the individual or the identity holder is in the center, so that they can control what type of data then they share when they interact with services, and they can sort of control and be responsible for their own privacy.
Jon Erik, you raised your hand.
Trust is a challenging topic, and we need to remember that trust is contextual. I mean, would I trust Google to deliver my email message to you? Yeah, I would. Would I trust Google to treat my data in a nice way? No, I wouldn't. Would I trust my bank to transfer the money? Of course I would. And this is part of the challenge with trust. And also the challenge with discussing trust being in the Nordics is that the trust in general is so high all over the place. We trust each other, we trust the government. And I mean, that's one of the main reasons we've been so successful with EIDs, with using the bank IDs, the NEM-ID, the Finnish Trust Network, because there is so high degree of trust, so we trust this centralized model. And I mean, we are in the forefront of the world of using EIDs.
Yes. So just, Jon Erik, you're also a technologist, and when you hear about what Marcus is describing with a consortium for enabling a layer of identity with, I suppose, possibilities for data portability and such, does this seem to you like a necessary service, given that we live in an API economy where integrations are made between different service providers?
I mean, standards are necessary for any kind of interoperability. I mean, now there's so many islands. Sometimes I compare to this to, I used to work with the creating email system back in the 80s. If anybody was around there, remember sending emails from one provider to another was a nightmare. The address formats, attachment, character sets, and all that. And that was solved by standards and complying to the standards. And it's the same thing, you know, with EIDs, where we are in the middle of, with trust across different landscapes, etc. So standards are definitely necessary to do this.
Yes, and given that, you know, both you and Finn have raised this issue, and there seems to be a responsibility placed on, for instance, the industries, what we say in Norway, bransjestandarder, yet I'm not seeing necessarily a lot of movement on this. How would you suggest we create this movement?
So, I mean, there's a lot of things going on in the European Union. I mean, for identities, it's the EIDES standard, which is still in the first version, but there's a second version being worked on right now. And that is about harmonizing EIDs and trust services across different countries. And when we talk about trust services, there's a number of them. There are certificates for signatures, there are validation services, etc. So there's different services. So I mean, that's a good starting point to make this happen by having these standardization organizations. And also, I mean, Etsy is working closely on this. And I mean, it might be a surprise, but there are currently no standard for how do you identify somebody online today. And even the EIDES just says, you know, well, you can, you know, do this or this, and you can look at the national regulation. Fortunately, now there is ongoing work in Etsy to set up a standard for how do you identify someone online.
Jonas, you would like to say something?
Yeah, I think that it's. I think that everybody is keeping it clear in their heads, but I think we're working with at least 3 or 4 different definitions of trusts, which is important to keep in mind. And one that we were kind of touching on earlier, which I think is important, is what sort of trust do we expect to have in the services that we buy, either as individual or as government? And you asked there, Nina, a question, why do we have to wait so long for the world to change? And is the world changing? And I think that from a perspective, the world is changing. So when we see in 2020, in Norway, we had one government initiative that was basically stopped because of insufficient trust and insufficient trust characteristics. when you do things like work with their school or daycare, you get these sort of consent forms for doing things like surveys and things, and we're working up to a higher level of expectations of trust and transparency. And also, you asked about what about tenders from the government, and as a matter of fact, I was just last Monday delivering a bid for a tender for my employer, and privacy was one of the requirements that we were asked to respond to in that tender. And we see that having a clear, as a supplier, having a clear expression of how you treat privacy is something that does resonate both with the buyer and with the public. So I think that we are seeing a change in the expectations, and I do think that the only thing that we need to know is that these changes take time, but they also require pressure. So I think we are on the right track, and we might go faster, but I think we're going at an okay speed.
Snorre, have we gotten any questions in, by the way?
Yes. One thing I really is a highlight question, like what are the risks entering the digital future without having enough protocols and enforcement in place? Is this something that has been considered?
What is meant by protocols and enforcement in this sense?
So we're talking a lot about protocols and needed things for digital identity to work. And of course, there might be very difficult for people to understand why do we need all these protocols and enforcement in place to live in a digital world. We don't see them. They work on our behalf. That's probably why we have both Datatilsynet and Forbrukerrådet to be there and protect us for the unknowing. But it's a question to be like, what are the risks of when these things are not in place in a digital future? What can we experience when we are not able to put this in place?
I think we should let Finn give his answer. And Eirik, but Finn first.
Okay, thank you so much. Obviously, again, from the perspective of the work that we have done, the research that we've done, and for example, when we looked into how the ad tech industry works earlier this year, we worked with the security firm Mnemonic and also a few other international experts, where we basically tracked the data that we put into 10 apps and where the data went. And what we discovered obviously wasn't such a surprise for us because we were working on this for a long time. But we basically managed to document how data brokers receive access to really sensitive information about where we live, our location data, our sexual preferences, and so much more. And we could see how, when you read the terms and conditions of these data brokers, we also saw that they all reserve the right to pass the data on and to collate the data from other sources, basically making digital twins of us. And this is a huge problem, and this is just one of them. And some of the problems we see with that, as you use that as an example, is the ability to predict our behavior. And I say predict because it doesn't necessarily give any sort of meaningful prediction. But based on these predictions, so these scores that were given, lots of decisions are taken on our behalf. That could be what kind of ads you see, what kind of ads you don't see. There's lots of evidence, especially from the US, where these sort of digital twins and these aggregated profiles and aggregated sort of consumer groups that are made have been used to discriminate against consumer groups or against groups, minorities, people who have some sort of risk attained to their profile risk. And as a result, people don't get job offers. They don't see ads for certain houses. They're discriminated, left out of the market. We also know that this data can be used to manipulate people, because when all this data is collected from all these different sources, quite a detailed pattern of our lives is revealed. So if you have some sort of vulnerability, let's say to gambling, or let's say to alcohol, or anything else really, it is possible for an advertiser or any sort of entity with interest of reaching you can use that vulnerability to manipulate you over time or in a very specific moment. So those are my worries. On a more sort of overreaching scale, I would say that this sort of this data will also sort of be hacked. Of course, there are lots of instances of our data profiles being hacked, and all this creates a chilling effect on our behavior, because we're afraid of being watched. We're afraid that what we say can be used against us, and that I think we should really, really worry about, because not only does that mean lost opportunities for businesses, because people are hesitant of using their services. Our research shows that one out of two Norwegians have not downloaded an app because we're worried about the privacy and security. And I think research from Datatilsynet confirms this sort of chilling effect. And I think that also, our freedom of expression is under threat, and a lot of other basic rights are under threat when this is happening. So we really need like a real change. And that's why I'm happy to hear there are business models coming up that are trying to address parts of this issue. But we really need to deal with these sort of also fundamental breaches of the law. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I notice that almost everyone in the panel raised their hand, and I think that maybe you guys should just unmute yourselves, and we can perhaps not use the hand function anymore, because now I think we've sort of warmed up. I think it's also just to reply to you, Finn. This is the discussion we often have about the chilling effect, about the misuse of the data. But if we also think about, if we try to move the conversation back to where we started, which was, the lack of freedom, rather, then, I think, Jon Erik, you were first.
So, Finn, you have some really good points there, and it's about people in general, and I think we as a community have an obligation to educate people. And people think, well, I use Facebook or Google or one of these, and I get some ads, and so what? That doesn't really matter. But the real product is not you. The real product is changing your behavior. Somebody out there is paying to change my behavior in some way or another, and that's the real danger. They're slightly nudging me towards a certain direction, and we need to educate on that to make people more aware. And that's, I think, a lot of power lies in that.
Many other of you had raised hands. Please just butt in.
I could...
Okay, Hilda.
Go ahead.
Okay, I go first. I raised my hand because I wanted to add something to what Finn was talking about. Of course, there are privacy and security issues here that are really important and that are at stake. But I also think it's important to discuss how our relationship with the government is, and how identification and a better control of how we communicate digitally with our government is also, a very important part of this. And then I would like to go back to what Marcus said, what is going on now in the EU with the development of the Gaia X, and how that way of building a platform can actually do both take care of security and privacy issues, and also give us a better communication as a citizen towards our government. And I was wondering also if we could discuss later maybe a little bit more about how that initiative could be a pan-European initiative, and also include Norway, which is not really an EU member, but also is part of the EU digital strategy now.
I think you have to perhaps explain what Gaia X is. I'm very curious to hear.
Well, I think that I want to leave that to Marcus. I think you're the expert here, so maybe you can do that.
So I
Could I answer that?
Yeah.
Yes, Marcus, please answer that first.
Okay.
And then you have.
So I think in general, Gaia X is such a broad topic that it's a bit uncertain to me what it is and what it isn't. But on a very high level, what Gaia X is aiming to establish is to sort of promote the data sovereignty of within the EU by creating sort of a infrastructure for federated use of data. So, and those of you who don't know what federated use means is that I, as an individual, would be able to authorize some other party to fetch data which I have in some place. But what it isn't is that it's not putting the user at the center, where the user is actually a control point. What type of, for example, data attributes in detail are being shared between these two services, or and so on. But it's going to be a very big initiative for the next coming years, and EU is going to invest billions into that. So we're sort of trying to figure out what it is and how it would enable new types of business models.
I would also like to add to that, because Nina, you said that things takes too long, but I also want to press that there's a lot of things happening which is necessarily not that visible in terms of both process within the law, but also when it comes to making code of conducts. Cloud services, which GaiaX is an example of, is also an example of a lot of very interesting processes which is happening in the EU, creating code of conducts for offering cloud services, which means that the US platforms will actually need to a large degree, change their behavior in order to be able to offer services within the EU, within those code of conducts. It takes time to do these things, but there are progress, and we are working on it. So there are pretty important things happening there. Also, when it comes to GDPR, the point of GDPR is doing what is now more or less some kind of personal responsibility to do that as part of the system. And one example of this is that when I talk to American friends of mine and tell them that in order for me to return my tax forms, I can reply to an SMS just saying yes. And that is unthinkable for a US citizen. They will they do not trust the government to do their taxes for them. We do. And to underscore that, I listened to a podcast a while back, and they made a point of the fact that in Russia, every transaction in the society has a cost between 10 and 100 times higher than in the Nordics. So every time you want to do something, the cost to the society is 10 to 100 times higher. And that's the key point here. That is, the society itself will be much, much more efficient. Even with small increases in trust, even though that the concept of trust is a complicated one.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the lack of trust is costly, obviously. I mean, the trust we have is beneficial. Like I said, it's why we have a functional EID system that makes it so easy. And you mentioned the taxes as well. And, you know, the challenge is how do you build that trust? I mean, it's on the contrary. I mean, trust is declining, and it doesn't help that some of the state leaders are using the lack of trust to their benefit.
Johannes, I'm sorry, Jon Erik, I just have to give you the word because you've been waiting for a while. So please.
I wanted to build on both what Eirik and Hilde were talking about. But so Eirik talked about how things are changing, but not necessarily in a visible way. And I think also things are changing when it comes to expectations, and also expectations of government behavior, as Hilde touched on. So as some people, so I'd like to use a practical example. As some of you know, the Norwegian Institute of Public Health is launching soon a new digital infection tracker app, Smittestopp, this time in version 2, and I'm in the advisory board as a volunteer for that. And one thing that we're noticing there is that when they let in quite a varied group of people, the requirement that the public puts on government is pretty high. So in this case, when you are reporting that you're infected with the system, you have to log in with the Norwegian identity solution, ID-porten. And what me and others on the advisory board are trying to achieve is that even though you log in with ID-porten and are identified, we don't want your contact graph to be, even in theory, possible to attach to that identity. So we are helping the Institute of Public Health to create a protocol to avoid, to validate that this is a person that was infected, but to lose the identity of that person. And that is something that is from the activist point of view anyway. This is now the expectation, that even though we trust the government to identify you, we don't want them to keep that identity when the data moves around in the system of systems here. So I think that's a pretty good example of how we are forcing, or how the expectations are changing, and I think in a good way.
I think I would like to a large degree now open for questions from the audience. And I see that you, Gorm, have raised your hand. But I'd like to actually just read your question for now, because we have so many people. So what you write here, if this is the question you'd like to ask, how does one best handle trust differently when services are delivered by ecosystems of actors where the participating parties to some extent are unmanaged? We have had this situation for a long time already. Is that a question anyone feels called to answer?
Well, I think that maybe, Gorm, have you investigated the Norwegian ID-porten portal? Oh wait, you're from Digdir. It's an interesting. It's an interesting part of the. It's an interesting point of view from when you are so familiar with what is done, because I think you're right that it's insufficient in many ways, but. I think all systems need to rely on a trusted party to begin with, and in this case with the government being trusted, and then we have to move that trust around in the ecosystem. And that's a bad answer, but I think it's a very difficult question. I don't know if it has a answer, although it is important.
I mean, the question. It's also. I mean, I'm reading the question again. I mean, the participant parties are unmanaged, and I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that. I mean, if it's. I mean, you're connecting as a user to a government service. Of course, government is managed. The banks are unmanaged. I'm not sure exactly understand what you mean in that context.
I think we need to let Gorm explain his question or his answer.
So by ecosystem, I mean that. More roles are participating in government services. So we have had examples like NIBI and OBOS, Nabohjelp, and so on, where you need to have inherent trust in a larger group of parties than defined parties. So when I listen to the discussion, it sounds like there are two parties involved, the user and some kind of provider. And that's a long time ago. So we see from ecosystems like Apple and so forth that we have many parties involved. So my question is, how do we kind of have a modern version of this discussion which addresses the ecosystem problem and not the two-party kind of problem?
Yes, Marcus, please.
Yeah, so I mean, whether you like it or not, I mean, banks have been doing this for ages. I mean, if you just look at how for example, payments work, you have every end customer is free to choose their own service provider and communicate through the banking network. And what we don't see is the sort of underlying complexity of technologies and contracts which exist. But for example, when it comes to, for example, SEPA payment transactions, there is a common rule book to which payment service providers need to adhere to, so that they can be part of the scheme. And so that's on a high level the type of model that could be applied for within the data economy as well, where different trust ecosystems should create their own rule books so that we can create more scalable data spaces.
Johannes and then Eirik.
So it's I'm very curious. I hope that Gorm will expand on the question, because like Marcus says, this is a place where we have solutions, and of course Digdir is in Norway part of this solution, but I think it is insufficient for the problem that Gorm is describing. So in Norway, if you're using a school portal, or if you're doing employment, or if you're doing some sort of taxation, then you will revert to using our national identity provider, ID-porten, which is actually delivered by Gorm's organization. And that again uses the bank as an infrastructure behind to establish the identity. And that works for a lot of scenarios, but it builds on the national identity number that we have. And when you have something like was mentioned, like helping neighbors, you might not want to use the national identity number as the identifier in that sort of transaction, but you still want to establish some sort of identity. And then in addition, you might have other identity providers, like we have EIDAS, which tries to address that. But I mean, to a great extent, I think Gorm already is coming from the point that Marcus is describing. But when we have in place a national identity provider, what is missing, and what are the next steps that we need to have to solve the ecosystem problem?
Yes, and Eirik, and then Finn.
Yeah, I just want to address what Marcus said about the bank infrastructure and the trust there, because it's used as an example today, at least in the Nordics, as a gold standard for how you can achieve trust. And also our own survey shows that people trust the bank services, at least in the Nordics. But this is not a given situation. And we do know that organizations like Facebook and Google and so on want to offer the same kind of services. They do want to offer financial services. And one of the reasons why the bank infrastructure today can do this is that they earn money. So they don't need to earn money on other way than on the transactions themselves. But what happens when they have been pressured by Google and Facebook and so on, and need to start looking at how do we finance our operation? Must we start to analyze our customers? Must we start to sell sales and buy patterns and so on? So we cannot trust that the trust is given. And that's why having this, for example, GDPR in the bottom is so important. Even though it's very tempting for the banking industry to open up and begin to sell a lot of customer data, they cannot do that because of the law, and also because they do also understand that they might lose trust, and thereby also be less interesting as a service offerer.
Fascinating. Finn, and then Jon Erik. Finn is still thinking.
No, I can't. Am I muted?
No, we hear you.
Okay, but if you can't hear me, can you hear me?
Yes. But you have actually poor connection. There's like, can we just take Jon Erik while we wait?
Yeah.
No, it's very interesting what you're saying about the banks, and I've been talking to banks for a number of years, and I'm trying to promote the idea that the banks need to recognize that their main product is trust. People tend to think of banks, their product is money and monetary transaction, but it's not. It's trust. We trust them to do these really important things on our behalf. And my take is that they should now extend this and also use this trust in identity, providing identity services, helping users with their identity challenges. And I guess the first bank that has taken that step is Rabobank in the Netherlands, which they have a good cooperation with. They are now providing identity services. And I think that's an interesting way to go, because I think we need these trust organizations. We cannot put all the responsibility out on the user. That's going to be too complex. Hey, we can't even handle the passwords, right? And now you're going to do, we handle everything from account recovery, etc. So we need this trust, and I think banks are in a good position to do that.
Okay, just quickly, Finn, did you have, now your connection is better. Would you like to say something? I'm not sure it actually is better.
Can I jump in with a follow-up question to Erik?
Sorry, actually, Hilde, I think it's your turn.
Okay.
And then Johannes.
This is maybe more a new question than a comment, but I've noticed that EU have outlined a vision for a European digital identity. And I wonder whether this is something that needs to be in place for all the other things that they're trying to do now with the Gaia X and so on. And I was wondering also what kind of common digital identity that is. So it's more like a question to some of your experts in the panel.
Well, actually, Marcus, would you like to answer that? That's a very good question.
Yeah, so that's one of my favorite topics. So, well, first of all, let's define what we mean by, or what I mean by when we talk about, when I talk about digital identity. To me, digital identity is basically sort of a digital twin of an individual, consisting of verified data, so that the individual can then prove something about him or herself. So it's not only the social security number or personal identification number, it's sort of the whole data space related to that, held by public authorities, can be given to the individual. So it seems to be quite clear when we have...
Live streaming is on.
Great. So when we have paper-based documents, it's quite clear that the individual can get the paper-based documents and then do whatever they want with them, publish them in a daily newspaper or whatever. But the same practices don't apply to digital data, which is a bit puzzling to me. And that's actually something that we should handle on a overarching regulatory level, that the people can actually control their own data and get access to it.
Erik.
Yeah, no, just quick comment. I mean, I completely agree with your definition. It's your digital twin or your avatar or whatever in cyberspace. To your question, about the European EID, I think at the current state, most states are struggling to get their EID functions national up and running, and then thinking it's going to be simpler to make it on an EU level. It's not, because then you have so many regulations. Like I said, even the onboarding, I mean, getting to know people, there are different rules, different laws in different countries on how that shall be established. Some require face-to-face contact, some can use video interviews, etc. So I think, with the exception of the Nordics, where we've been successful with the IDs, most countries are not at that stage at all.
I know you've had your hand up, Johannes. I'm really sorry, but now Finn, who's been waiting for a while, seems to have gotten his connection in order.
Or not.
Or not.
Or not. Okay. Okay, go on without me.
I'm sorry, Johannes.
Yeah, I think it's a good follow-up to what Jan-Erik was just talking about now as well. So when it comes to the identity systems that are in place or are being in place, from my perspective, the Norwegian infrastructure, including the bank idea that we have in Norway, is fairly well established. And you mentioned earlier that the banks should be in the business of selling trust and identity. In Norway today, with bank ID, they kind of are. So what do you feel is missing with the current state?
What's missing here is, I mean, this model we're using in the Nordics is not transferable to other countries because of the lack of the trust, right? And bringing in a new term, the verifiable credentials, which I think is really interesting, but it still needs some management around it. It's not like you can throw this at every individual that can't even manage the passwords. You need some stakeholder, some entity that will do this on my behalf. And hey, I'd be
so-
happy if my bank could do all the GDPR consents on my behalf. Say to the bank, you watch me, you take all these consents. If I, about to consent to something stupid, then stop me, and get rid of all this noise on the screen.
So you think that I hear you saying that the Norwegian model for identity is working well, but it's not necessarily implementable currently in the rest of Europe.
Yeah.
And secondly, you're also saying that maybe in addition you could have a service where managing consent is something that you have as a service.
For example, I would love to get rid of all this noise on my screen.
So sorry, but we have to have a few questions from the audience. And Snorre, you've been waiting for 20 minutes to provide them, so please.
Well, it's just been coming in along the way. And the first one, everyone's asking, will we be able to get resources to read more on this? And yes, that's why it didn't exist. So I'll just post a message here that follow us, and also everybody will get an email following up here with a lot of links and stuff to follow up on. So that's covered. We have one question which kind of falls back to the trust and where we are today. Like, who will issue trust and identity? Can anyone vouch for anything? If so, what will be the protocol used to issue claims and verify them? It kind of brings us back to, hey, we all now trust Bank ID to issue trust and identity. Will that trust be there forever? Now that Vipps is coming with their own solution, which basically is Bank ID, will we trust them to be as clean as they should be?
Wow, does anyone feel called to answer?
Can I very quickly reply, because I need to leave in 2 minutes?
Oh, yes.
So it depends on context. Whoever needs the data defines basically to which credentials they rely on and provided by whom. So it's very contextual.
Yeah, and it is complex. There's some attributes definitely comes from your government, right? You have your name, your date of birth, your national identification number, etc., which are provided by the government, and you need to trust them to provide that information.
Johannes?
Yes, I think it's very important to separate identity from data, in that we trust the bank and the government in Norway to identify us to services, but we don't want the data that we exchange with those services to be visible or to be controlled by the identity provider. And I think that it's very essential to get those two relationships separate. So that I don't think that I necessarily agree with the question, because you have one relationship, which is to identify you to a service provider, which you trust to identify you, and then you have one relationship with the service provider in what data you are trusting and what use of data you're trusting with that, and you don't want to bring the identity provider into that relationship, I think.
Yeah.
I would like Snorre, I would like to ask everyone to turn on their camera right now, so we can take a photo of all the participants, and just please do that while Snorre asks the next question.
Yeah. The follow-up question for that was, we only have one trust provider. How are we able to provide more? Well, we have two with did and Vipps, but it falls down to UX of who you use. So how can we be able to and allow innovation in the providing trust?
OpenID Connect.
that's horrible. You said it yourself. Who's going to be there behind and say, I trust Johannes to be Johannes?
Right. But I think this is partly back to, I briefly mentioned verifiable claims, and the whole idea, to put it very simple, is that I go to some provider that knows something about me. I get assigned piece of information that proves, I'm an employee of Signicat, or I'm, more than 50 years old, or whatever, some sort of credential, and then I can present that to somebody. And I think that's going to be somewhere in the future. And also back to what was mentioned here. I mean, the concern is not me providing information to a service provider. It's more that if there is some central party that can track all my movements across all these. And I trust Bank ID today not to use that information for some purpose that I'm not aware of.
Okay, just everyone, please turn on the camera. Everyone, everyone who's here, not just the people who've spoken, if they feel comfortable with it. So I guess this is a bit of a psychological test as well.
We can take the next question. When talking about standard, bransjestandard, how does this pay off for organizations? All the time, the public seems happy to trade data for free services. Like, how standards make it even more difficult to build business models as we know it today. So how can we make sure that we are able to think about the companies as well?
And that is the last question. Then we need to end.
Not sure I agree that standards make things more difficult. On the contrary, standards is what makes you can, in the physical world, you can buy different components from different places and put them together. There's a standard for a screw and a bolt, and there's standard for cabinets. You can put them together. It's the same thing in the digital world.
Agreed.
Okay.
Are different. I think we might talk about different things when it comes to standards. One is like the technical standard, but I think the question might be about standard of behavior. I'm not sure.
Okay, we need to round off now. I would like to thank everyone for participating, and I think that we actually became very concrete at the end, and I'm very, very pleased with that, because this, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a discussion that often remains in the clouds, not literally, Eirik, but figuratively. And so I would like to thank you all for joining. And as Snorre said, we will send out information with the recording and the links that were given today. And if you also more information about us, Digital Identity Nordics. And we will be following up with a new debate, this time examining health data in this context of, control and the possibilities. So I would like to say thank you very much to the panel and all the people who have participated, and have a wonderful Friday.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Slowly popping off.
Yeah. I'm actually not sure when I should leave this conversation myself. Do you want to take a copy of all the questions, Snorre?
We have it on Slido, so it's okay.
Okay, we have it on Slido. Okay. Well, anyway, I think I'm going to be jumping out now. So goodbye, everyone.
I'll stay there for a couple of minutes if anyone wants to talk.
Okay, yeah.
Thanks for now. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Ja. Det siste er potensielt bare sånn som har åpnet tabben. Ja. Hei.
Hei, og takk for sist.
Takk for sist.
Ja, streaming er av og sånn.
Hva sa du?
Er streaming fortsatt på?
Det er den. Vi kan skru den av, så slipper vi det. Der er den borte.